Hello again. We have produced a number of videos showing how to use icustom to gather information from custom indicators into your expert advisors, and some on how to draw indicators on charts like up and down arrows or buy and sell levels. But a question that keeps coming up is from people who have a custom indicator that draws these arrows or lines on the chart, and how can they get that information into their expert advisor? Quite often the indicators that draw those kind of arrows, the buy and sell signals or the entry and exit signals, don't use a buffer to store the values. And so the icustom simply won't work, because icustom will only work with indicators that draw traditional type lines on the chart that fit into a buffer. So how do you get the values from those up and down indicators? And in the background at the moment, I have an indicator that is drawing up and down arrows on bars. And this indicator does not maintain that information in a buffer at all. So I can't use icustom in an expert advisor. There is no one or standard way that these kind of objects can be drawn on the screen. Programmers have a number of options available to them. And so you'll have to do a certain amount of investigation if you want to be able to use these. So today I'm going to take you through the key things to look for if you're trying to understand what your indicator is doing, so that you can find these objects on the screen. And then I'm going to write two expert advisors that work with two different techniques for creating these objects on screen, so that you can get the values from those objects, like the screen objects, into your expert advisor and trade. Now, as I said, almost every indicator is going to draw these in a different way. The types of objects drawn on the screen will be different. The names of them will be different. I'm going to point you at the things that you need to look for to be able to identify these. So I hope this is useful to you. Let's run the disclaimer and then we'll get into the code. So I've got a chart open here. This is in MetaTrader 5, but the principles are the same for MetaTrader 4. And you can see if I zoom in a little bit that I'm drawing these little arrows. This is an indicator that I wrote just so that I could do this demonstration. There's no specific logic to it. It just draws an arrow at the top of the up candles and at the bottom of the down candles. And this is so that I can just get a lot of arrows drawn on the chart. It also reuses the arrows. You can see they only go back a short way, and as it creates new arrows, it deletes the old ones. So assuming this is an indicator and I want to write an expert advisor to trade when these arrows appear, I'm going to need to know a few things about the arrows first. The first thing I want to know is the name. If I just hover over one of these, you can see a name appears there. This one's called test arrow by 1. If I hover over a different one, this is test arrow by 0. And this one test arrow by 2. And if I hover over the bottom ones, you can see that I've called them test arrow sell. Now that's my convention. If you're going to be using this on another custom indicator that you've had written, you'll need to know the name there. So you want to investigate these and see what that name is, because you'll use that name in the expert advisor to be able to identify which of these objects on screen you're going to process. So we can see from this that my naming convention is test underscore arrow underscore and then buy or sell. But next I want to know something about the properties of that. You can sometimes get to it by double clicking these and then you get little handles around them, but that doesn't always work, and you can see it hasn't worked here. That's because they're not selectable the way they've been drawn here. What you can do is right click on the chart somewhere, select object list. So now even after opening the object window, there's nothing showing here. You sometimes have to click this list all button, and that brings up the object that I've got on screen. Here are the names again, and I've followed a nice simple naming convention. There's no guarantee that your indicator will follow this same convention or any particular convention, but you'll work out as much as you can from here. Usually they will begin with a common name, but then at the end of that maybe just a random number. But what I really want at this point is to know more about it. I don't want to just know the name. I can see from this that it's an arrow. It's showing up there as the object type. So if I click that line, test arrow by 1, and go to properties, then I can go to the parameters tab here, so common parameters and visualization, and I can see the arrow type, and this is a type by. There are a whole lot of different types of arrow. Now if this were not an arrow, there would be something else. In fact, let me just draw something else on the screen. All right, I've just added a horizontal line to the screen. If I go back to the objects window, there's my horizontal line, and if I go to the properties of that, there are no specific parameters. So a horizontal line is just a horizontal line. But you'll need to know as much as you can. So if there's nothing else in the parameters, then it's just a horizontal line. Or if it's one of these arrows, then you go to the parameters and it's an arrow type cell. And that's important in the coding because they're all different types of objects. And I want to know those because when I'm looking at these objects appearing or disappearing or moving on the screen, I want to identify by the name, if possible, that it is an indicator that I'm looking for, and by the type also, just in case some indicators might draw lines on the screen as well as the arrows to indicate when a trade should be taken. I only want to find the arrows, for example, or maybe they just draw a lot of other information on the screen like text, and I want to pull some of that out. So armed with those pieces of information, I've got a name and I've got the type, which is arrow, and it's either an arrow up, and let me just look at the properties here, it's either an arrow sell or an arrow buy that I'm looking for. And obviously you'll have to determine that based on your own indicator. Now this indicator also, because it only draws these objects on screen, has no data buffers. Here in the data window I've just expanded it a little so you can see it has no values showing in here. These are just the standard values from the candles on the chart. So typically in an expert advisor you would use icustom to get the values from the custom indicator, but where an indicator is just drawing objects like these arrows on screen, then you can't use the icustom function. So I'm going to write an expert advisor now that reads the values from these on-chart objects, and while it won't do any trading, it will at least display messages to say that it's detected these changes. Now I've got the MQL5 editor open here, but this code works in MQL4 as well. I've just made one comment here. For the MQL4 you would want to add property strict at this point, but apart from that all of this is going to be common between the two. Now I've set this indicator up, or I've set this expert up already. I've used the wizard to just create this, and then I've just tidied up the comments a little bit and changed the formatting. Now the first thing, I gathered the name of these objects from the chart, so I know that they have a given prefix. Obviously this might be different with your indicator, but for my indicator they all begin with that test underscore arrow. So I'm specifying a global scope variable here. I'm just calling name part, and then I'm going to fill that in with that prefix so that I can use that to compare the objects that I find on the chart. Now for my indicator, every time there's a new arrow I actually delete the old arrow and create the new one. So I'm going to be detecting those events happening. But in order to do that I need to set some chart properties before the chart will tell me when those objects are being created. And those two properties are the chart event object delete and chart event object create, and I'm setting both of those to true. So by doing that with the chart set integer function, and 0 is my chart number, so 0 is the current chart. So I'm telling that chart to notify me when there is an object delete or an object create event happening. Without that, it simply won't tell me when those objects are created and deleted. So all of that setup's done in the onInit section. There's nothing for the onDinit, and because I'm detecting these objects appearing and disappearing on the screen, there's nothing in onTick either for this particular expert advisor. Now you may want to put something else in here to process maybe trailing stops, but this is just an example expert and I have nothing to put in the onTick. Everything I'm going to do now will be in the OnChartEvent because that's where I'm detecting that these objects are being created. Now there are 4 arguments in the OnChartEvent. ID, which is actually the enum for the event type, and then lparam and dparam are not used for object creation and deletion, but sparam has the name, that name that we identified earlier, the test underscore arrow underscore number, that is contained in sparam. So the 2 variables that I'm interested in are the ID telling me what's happened and sparam giving me the name of the object. And in my case I've identified a name for those objects and I've stored the prefix already in a global variable. And I know that every time there is a signal from my little indicator that it creates a new object on screen. So I'm actually looking for the object create events happening. So only on object create. So I'm testing there if the ID is equal to chart event object create. Now maybe you also want to know if objects are deleted. but I don't care about that at the moment. I know that when an object is deleted, it's just being done so that it can create a new object. So I'm actually looking for new objects being created with the chart event object create. And then I'm just going to call a function that I'm calling new object, and we'll see that in a moment, and I'm passing the name of that object and return. And that's everything for the OnChartEvent, because all the work is going to be handled in this new object function. So now the new object function has the one argument, which is the name of the object that's just been created, name. I only want to look for objects where the name matches. Now obviously this test might be different in your case because you might have an indicator that gives a different type of naming convention to the objects. That's just something you're going to have to work out on your own indicator. But at least mine have a common prefix, which is test_arrow_. So I'm comparing that prefix. String len name part gives me the length of this name prefix that we set up earlier with test_arrow_. And string substr gives me the beginning characters from name. So substring beginning at position 0 for the length of this prefix. And if that matches the name part that I set up earlier, so I'm taking this prefix from the name, if that matches the known prefix, or if it doesn't match the known prefix, I've got a not equals here, then I'm just going to return. So that avoids cases where some other object on the screen has been created and it doesn't match the naming conventions, and I can just exit there. I also want to make sure that this object is in the correct window. So I'm looking at chart number 0, but if I've got something like a stochastic or an RSI, that opens a second window underneath that, and I want to make sure the object I'm looking at is in the main window. Again, yours might be different. You might be looking for something in the RSI or the stochastic window, and you'll have to adjust this for the appropriate window. But I'm looking for the main window, which is window number 0. And so I can use the object find function, passing in the name and the chart number 0, which is current chart, and that returns the sub window. And if that sub window is anything other than 0, then I'll just return. Now I also want to make a test to make sure that not only does the name match what I'm looking for, but it's the type of object that I'm looking for, because the indicator may well be drawing other objects on screen and using the same naming prefix on those. So I'm only looking for buy arrows and sell arrows, which is what we identified from the object properties earlier on the chart. And I can get the type using the object get integer function, passing in the chart number, the name of the object, and looking for the objprop_type. And I know from looking at the object properties they were arrows, and they were arrows of a subtype buy or sell. So I'm looking for obj_arrow_buy or obj_arrow_sell. Now if you're not getting buy and sell arrows, if you're getting some other indicator, you'll just have to decide what these object properties are. You can find those in the help information. So here in the help information under object types, you can see all the object types that you can be looking for. I am looking for the obj_arrow_buy or the obj_arrow_sell. So once I've passed those tests, I know that this is an object that's been created from my indicator that I want to do something with. Now in my particular expert advisor here, I don't have anything to do, so I'm just going to report that and use some print statements to show what I've found. And I'm going to call a subroutine again for that. So I'm just calling a function here that I'm going to write in a moment called report object, and I'm saying that I've found a new object and giving the name, and this report object will actually pull the details out for that. So now the report object function, I'm passing in the event as a string, which in this case is just new because my particular indicator only creates new objects that I care about, and then the name of the object's been created. And then depending on your expert advisor, you may want various properties from that object. So to get the time where that object exists, and the time is, if we go back to the chart, these arrows all exist on a given bar on the chart, and so I'm getting the time or the opening time for that bar. So the object time I can get with the object get integer function, always calling with the chart number, the name of the object, and objprop underscore time gives me the time of that object. I'm casting this to a date time then, just to avoid warnings from the compiler. Next, I'm getting the object type again. I know I pulled that out earlier, but here in the report object I'm just getting it a second time using the object get integer, objprop underscore type, and that's just because I'm going to print the type of the object found. And now I want to know which bar number I found that time for, and I can use the ibar shift function, and I'm calling that with the current chart symbol, the current chart period, and then the time that I retrieved earlier, and that will give me the bar number on the chart. And then I'm getting the price where that arrow was drawn. That's with the object get double function. Again, chart number 0, name of the object, and objprop underscore price. Now, don't necessarily rely on this as being the price where you need to trade, because quite often objects are drawn on the chart and they're offset from the candle by a little, just for visual purposes. So you really need to decide what the price is that you want to use in your trading. And this is where you would pull in some other values from the chart. And so I'm getting the bar high, for example, just using the ihigh function, symbol, period, and the object bar, which came in earlier. And I'm also getting the bar low using the ilow function, same thing. And then I'm just going to print those values. So this is where you might be trading based on these indicators coming out. So I'm printing the event name, the name of the object, type of the object, and then the values that we extracted, the time, bar number, price, high and low prices. For the time, I'm using the time to string function to convert that time to a printable string, and then just passing in the variables into the print format. And that's it. Let me just make sure there's no mistakes in here. Forgot to terminate this function. Alright, now I'll just go over to the chart. I've already got the indicator running, so I'm getting new arrows all the time. I will load that expert advisor on, and then in the experts tab here we'll see the messages come up. So my indicator prints an arrow on every bar, so I shouldn't have to wait too long. And now a new bar's formed. I've got the up arrow appearing here, and it tells me this is where you would trade. I've got a new event, meaning it's found a new arrow. The name of the object, test arrow by 0. It's a buy arrow, and here are the various time, bar number, prices. So that's an expert advisor that will find those arrows being created on the chart and can react to them. And your indicator may draw lines or prices. You'll just have to adjust this according to whatever your indicator is creating. But this is only going to work in the case, as I've created here, where my indicator is building new arrows. So each time I get a new bar, I'm drawing a new arrow, and I'm cycling through 3 different arrows, 0, 1 and 2, and I just delete the old arrow and create a new one. If I change that indicator though so that it moves the arrows instead of drawing new arrows, then this won't work. And I have another indicator that does the same thing, but it does actually move the arrows as it creates new bars. So I'll leave that expert running, and I'll load the other indicator on the screen. Now I've loaded a different indicator on the screen. It also draws the arrows on each bar, or each bar that has moved up or down. It doesn't draw them if a bar doesn't change price. But in this case, it will simply move the existing arrow forward to a new position rather than delete and recreate. So I can see there a new bar has formed, a new arrow is here, or rather an arrow has moved here, but nothing's been printed by the expert advisor that's still running. And that's because the create and the delete events don't fire when you simply change the position of an object on screen. And in fact, there is no event that fires if the code simply repositions an object on screen. So the only way we can deal with those is to actually capture all of the objects that are on screen that we're monitoring and watch for changes in those at each tick. So let's write a new version of that expert advisor and we'll change it so that it can detect these changes. So now I've just taken a copy of my original object watch and I've created a new object watch v2. This is all the same code so far. I want to monitor the objects on screen and know when they change, and to do that I need to know what's already there. So I'm going to create a structure that holds the key information about the objects on screen for me. So this is my structure, sObjectInfo. I want to know the name of the object, the type, the time, and the price. That's what's relevant to me. Now you may want to include more information. And then I'm declaring an array. I'm just calling this objects of type sObjectInfo, and I'm going to use that to hold a list of all of the objects that I find on screen. Now coming down to the onInit section, I'm going to initialize this objects array. So first I'm resizing it to 0. Then I'm calling a function called loadObjects, which I will write, and I'm telling this loadObjects function to look for buy arrows and sell arrows. I could have coded those inside the loadObjects, but I decided to make this a little more generic, and if I decide to look for 3, 4, 5 different object types, I can simply call this again and again, and it will load up this objects array with whatever it finds of that type that matches this name part. So let's just go down and write that load object straight away. I'll insert it here just before new object. So load objects, I'm passing in the object type that I'm searching for. So first I'm getting a count of the total number of objects that I want to look for using this variable count, using the function objects total. And the arguments to this are the screen number or the chart number and the sub window. And remember, I'm looking at the main chart, which is sub window 0, and I'm passing in the type. So that will tell me how many obj arrow buy or obj arrow sell it's going to find on the chart. And then a standard loop, I'm going from 0 up to less than the count using I++. And I'm grabbing the name of that object using the object name function. Again, chart number, the index of that object, sub window, and the type. So this will simply scan through all of the objects that match to this object total search. And then I call the new object function. And that's all in load object. Now remember, new object already has a test here to check the name matches the prefix. So while this is scanning through every object, it calls new object, and if they're not objects of the type that I'm looking for, or not of the name that I'm looking for, then this will simply return. New object also needs to change. I don't want to necessarily report the object. I'm calling this from this load objects, where I'm simply gathering a list of the objects that are already on screen so that I can track them. So first thing I'll do is add some activity to capture those into those object array that I created earlier. I'm going to create this add object function. But also, when we're in this loop of load objects, I don't want to take action on every object. So I don't want to go through this, well, in my case I'm only reporting on the object, but if this is actually trading, you don't want to do that. So I'm also adding in here a little statement where I'm adding a second argument to this called take action. And when I'm in the load objects, I'm just going to pass false to that. And then here, I can put if take action, then I'll report the object or do my trading on that object. So to summarize the changes in the new object, I've added this argument to say whether I want to do any trading based on a new object being found. I've created this function add object, or making a call to that add object function, and I'm only calling the execute actions if this take action is true. Now we'll get to the add object in a few minutes. I want to go through the rest of the actual processing code first. So first, back to the OnChartEvent. In the first version, I only looked at objects being created. I didn't care about them being deleted. That just meant they were disappearing and they were being reused. But I don't know what your indicator is doing, and maybe a deletion of an object is important. I also want to be able to remove objects from that array if there is an object deleted from the chart. So another statement very similar to the object create, but this is for object delete. And then I call this delete object, passing in the name, and we'll write that function again in a moment. But these are the only two events that we can accurately find where the objects are being created and deleted by code. There are other events that might be fired if the objects are drawn by hand, as in you go in with the mouse and create them. But if you're trying to monitor an indicator, then it's creating these objects by code, and these are the only two things we can reliably find. So to know if an object is moved on screen, which is what my latest version of the indicator is doing, where it's moving the arrows around rather than drawing new arrows, we have to simply check each time we get a tick to see if the objects have changed. Now, because I can't detect an event for the object being moved on screen or modified in some way, all I can really do is, in the onTick event, look for any differences between the objects I've stored in memory in that objects array and the actual objects on screen. So I'm writing a function, or I will write a function in a moment, called hasChanged, which will compare all of the objects on screen with what I know of them in memory. And so that hasChanged will return the name of any object that has changed. Now you'll see when I write this, it looks for the first object that it finds that has changed. If you're expecting more than one object to change on the screen in a single tick, then you might want to modify this to return an array, but at the moment I'm just returning the first object, or the name of the first object. And so if that name comes back as an empty string, then I know that nothing has changed. But if it is not an empty string, so if name is not equal to empty string, then I'm calling the report object, which is my version of the part of the code that would execute some kind of trade. But this time I'm passing in the changed event. That may or may not be relevant to your trading, but this tells me that the object has changed, and I'm passing the name of the object. So the same call as when I'm adding an object, but instead of calling new, I'm calling this with the changed event. But then I'm also calling the add object again, and this is a function that I've mentioned earlier but we haven't written yet. When I write this function, it will deal with not only adding new objects but updating existing objects. So I know that this one has changed. I don't want to detect this every time I come through the loop, so I'm going to call the add object function, and that will update what we know about that object in the objects array in memory. So that's the onTick. Now I'm processing this every tick. If you know that your indicator only works once per bar, then you may want to only process this once each bar, but at the moment I'm doing this on every tick. So now we can look at these new functions that I've created. We'll start with the hasChanged function. So I'm starting by count of the total number of objects that I have in memory, and then I'm just looping through those with a standard for int I equals 0 up to less than count. And then I've got another function that we'll write where I'm saying if object has changed index I, then I'm returning the name of that object. Now this is where, if you think more than one object might have changed, you would accumulate these into a list of names and then return that at the end. But I'm returning the name of that object as soon as it's found. And I'm doing that on the basis that I'm only recording the change in that one object, and then the next time there is a tick, if there is a second object, I'll find it on the next tick, but you might want to look for all the objects at one time. And if nothing has changed, then we'll fall through to this point and return an empty string. Now the object has changed. This is the function being called from here. I'm passing in the index. So I'm getting the name of that object based on the index from the objects array. And I'm testing if the type is not equal to the type using the object get integer function, now type is unlikely to change, but it's possible, then I'm returning true. I'm simply saying if the type is different to the object the type that I know, then return true. I'm doing the same for the price, the time. So for all of these, I'm simply getting the value from the current on-screen object using the object get integer or object get double, and comparing those to the values that I've stored in the array of objects. And if all of those fall through, then I'm simply returning false, meaning the object has not changed. So just a few simple functions remaining. We already have the report object function. We're going to look at the add object and the delete object function. So I'll put these down at the end of the code. Before we can actually do an add object, we need to know if the object already exists in our array of objects. So first there's a find function. So just passing the name and first grabbing the size of the object's array and then looping through that array until I find an object I with a name that matches the name that was passed in. And as soon as I find one, I'm just going to return the index number for that. And assuming I don't find one and go all the way through the array, then means my array of objects doesn't have an object of that name. I'm just going to return -1. So a simple find function there. So the add object function, also receiving the string of name. And the first thing I do there is call the find object function, passing that same name. Now if index is less than 0, that means we didn't find it in here and fell through to this return -1 statement. Then I set the index to the size of the object array. So if there are 5 objects in the array, or if there are 5 elements in the array, then the index will be 5, but remember the highest numbered element will be number 4 because the indexing begins at 0. So then I resize the array of objects at index +1, so I'm making it 1 larger, and I'm just adding an extra 10 here. This is a performance value. By adding that 10, it means that next time I resize the array, if it's still within the first 10 that were allocated, it's much faster. It will only have to actually allocate more memory when it runs out of this 10 spare that I create. And so if it's gone through this part of the loop, index was originally the total size of the array, but now I've resized the array by 1, so index is now the number of the last element in the array. So remember, if the array is size 5, then the last is number 4. I've added 1 to that, so now the array is size 6 and the last element is number 5. And then I'm just assigning the values. I'm assigning the name to the name property of the objects. And then I use object get integer to get the object type. I use object get double to get the object property price. And I use object get integer to get the object property time, and I just cast that to a date time variable. So that takes care of add, and because I've got this index equals find object, that will not only add new objects, which we'll do by going through here and allocating the next element in the array, but it will also update existing objects in the list. And then delete object, which if you remember from the chart event, if the ID is a chart event object delete, then I call the delete object function. So first thing again, I search this with using the find object. But in this case, if I don't find anything, I don't really need to do any work. So I'm only running this if index is greater than or equal to 0. And then I'm getting the size of the array. And now I'm looping from that index point as long as I is less than count minus 1. So if my array size is 5 and I found the index at 2, I'm going to begin at position 2 and I'm going to go until I is less, or as long as I is less than 4. And then all I'm doing is assigning objects I to be objects I plus 1. So I'm effectively collapsing the array by removing that one element from the middle. And then I do a resize of the objects array to count minus 1, just removing the last element from the array. I'm just printing a deleted statement here. Let's just see if I've made any mistakes in this. Try to compile that. Okay, got a couple of warnings due to a type conversion, but they are not going to be relevant to us here. So I'm now going to run this expert advisor. So here I still have the object watch version 1 running, and it's not reporting anything here as new arrows are being created because they're being created by moving old arrows up to the front of the list. I'm going to remove that. And now I've replaced that with the object watch v2. And now I've had a new arrow, or an arrow has moved up to the front. And we see the events changed because it has detected that arrow has moved. So the object watch v2 will deal with this type of event where the arrows are moving, but it will also deal with new arrows being created. It didn't report the existing arrows on the chart because we have that flag on the initial load that it will ignore them. But if I remove these arrows and restart the indicator, let me just remove the indicator. You can see it's detected the object deletion on all of these arrows when I removed them. So now if I add that indicator back, and I'll clear that, and now the indicator has drawn a new arrow. There are none already on the chart because I deleted them all, so this has had to create the arrow, and you can see the event here says new. So this object watch v2 will detect new objects being created, and it will also detect changes in the existing objects. Now, as I've tried to say several times, this is an expert that works with my indicator. You will need to do the investigation on your own indicators to determine the names of the objects that are being created and the types of the objects, and if there's anything else that's relevant in terms of when they're created and where they're created on the chart. But this at least gives you a technique to begin to identify when those objects are appearing on the chart and to be able to react to them. I hope this has been useful for you. If it has, click the like button. And if you want to see more of our videos, then click subscribe, and if you click the bell icon, you'll be notified when we release a new video. So until next time, thank you for watching.